Since World War II, the United States has spent an estimated 10 to 11 trillion dollars on foreign wars. To illustrate this, 1 billion seconds is 32 years. Many of you listening to the sound of my voice have lived longer than 1 billion seconds. Many of you will live longer than that. However, 1 trillion seconds with a T is 31,700 years. Think of it. The difference, 32 to 31,700. To further illustrate this, if you were to get $1 bills and you wanted to stack them until you got $1 trillion, that would be 67,866 miles. That's more than 28 times higher than the International Space Station. Imagine doing that 11 times. That's enough height to go all the way to the moon or the sun and all the way back down to the earth multiple times over. On top of that, you can't quantify a human life. When a mother loses her son, when a young girl loses her father, you can't quantify that on a spreadsheet. However, when the Pentagon is looking at possible military intervention, they have to weigh how many casualties they think will end up happening. We've lost 104,000 service men and women post World War II. Mothers had to bury their sons. Young children were without fathers. Communities lost members. But according to people like Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro, we need more wars. According to those idiots, we need to continue this. Meanwhile, the leading cause of bankruptcy in America is unpaid medical bills. Being able to ascertain a home is impossible for an average American citizen. Rent prices are going up. Grocery prices are going up. Gasoline prices are going up. I saw today, according to AAA gas prices, it's $4.07 a gallon now, up from $4.03 a gallon. The cost of a college education is unattainable unless you want to start your life in debt and have to pay all that back. Could take 10 to 20 years. But let's keep all these wars going on, according to Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro. Of course, they never served, and they would never send their own people overseas, but they want all of us to go over there for them. And they claim to love the troops. No, Mark, you don't care about the troops. If you cared about the troops, you wouldn't want these wars to keep going on. You only care about your own country. We all know which country that is. But I digress. Looking at these post-World War II conflicts, what did we receive? When you spend money, time, and it costs lives, the question is, in war, what did you tangibly gain? The first conflict, called the Forgotten War, which happened 5 years after World War II, was the Korean War. I'm going to be honest with you. I was persuaded as I looked into this conflict, as I dissected and contextualized this conflict. You could make the case it was worth it. Let me explain my case. After World War II, you partitioned off large parts of the globe, like East and West Germany. Korea was the same. In the north, you had the Soviet-backed communist. In the south, you had the more Western-centric, capitalistic South. The North Koreans went over the 38th parallel and invaded the South. The 38th parallel is the area of demarcation. It's the militarized zone that even exists to this day between North Korea and South Korea. The North Koreans went over that line. Now, if the United States were to not act on that, you always got to ask yourself, compared to what? That means that Korea would have been communist, and it would have not been an ally in the East Pacific region. Douglas MacArthur, who was in Japan at the time during the occupation, led the United Nations over there. Was around 16 countries involved if you dissect the entire conflict. And for a period of time, the United States had the advantage, and the United Nations. They had a masterful landing behind enemy lines in Incheon, and this was crafted by MacArthur himself, who was idiosyncratic. He was pompous, but he's a brilliant general nonetheless. A lot of those great generals like George Patton and MacArthur, they were great generals, and we could use them today, but they were maniacs and not the type of person you would probably want to be friends with, but they could definitely win the wars, but I digress. They went into Incheon, and they were driving and whacking and blitzing and just totally decapitating the North. They were running and putting up little resistance. However, what ended up transpiring, the Chinese, who just had their civil war, had the communist troops get involved in the conflict. And MacArthur, who boasted braggadociously the conflict will be done by Christmas, it ended up becoming a stalemate. And in 40 degrees below zero, where the troops were eating turkey and celebrating Thanksgiving, the ground was frozen, so they couldn't build trenches. It was a stalemate. And then, of course, MacArthur was used to winning. The United States had not lost a war in the 20th century. But Harry Truman was of the thought that if you attacked China, the Soviets, who had a nuclear weapon, they could have gotten involved, and that could have led to World War III. And MacArthur, being the kook he was, again, brilliant general, but very much an egomaniac with delusions of grandeur, he wanted to actually use nuclear weapons again in China. And that would have started a wider war. And because he was disobeying orders and the commander-in-chief, not the military man, are the ones who run the military, they ended up dismissing MacArthur, who kept disregarding orders. But the net result, as I said, you can make the case it's worth it. Here's my case. Instead of being communist, South Korea is now a strategic ally in East Asia. And it's a good buffer against China in that region. The average South Korean is 20 to 25 times wealthier than the average North Korean. South Korea, even to this day, is the only country in the history of the world to go from a net debtor country to a net payer country. They now put money into the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and all these international organizations. It was only 1953 when you had the war end. It wasn't necessarily ending the war. It was a ceasefire because you still have both countries at a demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel. The war technically never ended. Multinational corporations, which you probably heard of, Samsung, Hyundai, and Kia, they all are in South Korea. And also one of the largest microchip companies, I forget the name at the moment. You can make the case that instead of being communist completely, South Korea is a strategic ally. Okay, I will concede to you on that. However, Vietnam, which happened 2 years and around 5 months, don't quote me on that verbatim, around that, after that, wasn't, based on the results. Before the United States got involved and the French were involved, it was communist. The United States, despite spending 15 years there, spanning multiple administrations, Johnson and then Nixon finally ended U.S. involvement, it remained communist. Now, I made a video about Nixon's presidency, which I think is a lot more nuanced than he's given credit for because of his personal flaws and his paranoia. Nixon did have a plan in place to keep funding South Saigon, but we view the world based on results rather than intentions. And because of Watergate and an innumerable amount of factors, if the United States never went into Vietnam, spent all that money, lost all those lives, it would have been communist. The benefits did not outweigh the cost. You continue. One they like to bring up is, what about the Gulf War? Well, here's what you got to realize. The Gulf War led to the Iraq War. But before that, long story short, I won't try to keep doing a bunch of backstories here. But foreign policy is circular. Usually one war, one conflict doesn't determine the outcome unless it's on a large global scale, like World War I or World War II. Many times, countries have 2 or 3 wars, which really decide the outcome. The Iraq-Iran War, the United States, during that conflict under the Reagan administration, they supported Iraq. They gave them weapons. They let them use U.S. intelligence. They let them use chemical weapons like Agent Orange. It is what it is. And then eventually what happened was they tried to go into Iran and overthrow the Ayatollah. As a result of that, Saddam Hussein incurred a lot of debt to fund the war. Part of that debt was owed to Kuwait. He wanted Kuwait to forgive the debt. He also accused them of overflowing the oil market because he wanted to make more oil money. And because of that, he went into Kuwait. If it wasn't for the United States helping Saddam Hussein, he never would have precipitated that. And then the Gulf War never would have happened. But then after the Gulf War, near the end of it, they did not support the Kurds and other groups going after Saddam Hussein. Saddam survived. And of course, they try to carpet bomb him and other things like that. And they try to go after him under Operation Desert Fox during the Clinton administration. But nothing really happened. He remained in power. And then that galvanized W. Bush to do the Iraq War. Now, by every metric you want to use, Iraq was worse off after Saddam Hussein was gone. Iraq was poorer. The casualty rates of the civilians were higher. The government was more corrupt. What did we really receive that was beneficial in Iraq? Yeah, it's getting a little better now, but for a large period of time, it was worse off than it previously was. What about Afghanistan? Afghanistan, first, Jimmy Carter funded the Taliban initially, and that is what really led to this conflict transpiring. But after 15 years, the longest war, longer than Vietnam in American history, the United States pulled out, leaving weapons, leaving aircraft, just there to be taken. All those lives, all that time, and they just pulled out and went home. What was the point of all of it? What did we receive, Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro, from all these wars? Tell me. Certain presidents, probably not this one's pretty dumb, one of the dumber ones we've had, but certain presidents who are more perceptive can learn from these things. For example, Theodore Roosevelt resigned as Secretary of the Navy to get involved in the Spanish-American War. And that was really when you had the precipitous rise of the U.S. empire. Theodore Roosevelt envisated a large global empire owned by the United States. Him, Henry Cabot Lodge, and others romanticized building an empire. The point is, though, he resigned. He had the Battle of San Juan Hill. And he was viewed as a war hero, even though the casualty rates were 8-1, and in terms of people who were unalived based on disease versus casualty rates. It was totally one-sided, but being a great self-promoter, he was viewed as a war hero. And he pushed for the Medal of Honor, but he didn't get it in his lifetime. Bill Clinton eventually gave it to him in the 90s. But the point is, he had an insatiable thirst for adventure and glory. But once he used that fame and he catapulted to the vice presidency, McKinley was unalived, won't go into that at this particular moment. Roosevelt became president, and the imperialists thought, because at the time they weren't called neocons, they weren't called interventionalists. The terminology has changed within the years. Initially, they were called the imperialist. And people who opposed imperialism, such as Mark Twain, Booker T. Washington, former President Grover Cleveland, William Jennings Bryan, and even, surprisingly, Andrew Carnegie, he even proposed buying Cuba and Puerto Rico out of his own pocket if the United States would not give them their freedom. But they were viewed as the anti-imperialist, and then interventionalists, who we would call neocons today, like Theodore Roosevelt, were viewed as the imperialist. Roosevelt became president, and surprisingly, he only intervened in one foreign country, that was in Panama, when he established the Panama Canal. Under his tutelage, the United States never lost any troops when he was president, and he even bragged about that, but it was true. You can be cocky if you can back it up. It's not called bragging if you back it up, in my opinion. He learned that the United States had problems domestically. He ended up going after the robber barons through the trust busting. He broke up the monopolies of the top 1%. What's interesting is Taft did a lot more to go after the monopolies than Roosevelt did. That's the interesting part about it. Even though Roosevelt didn't think he was doing enough, ironically, Taft did more to break up monopolies and busted more trust than he did under his tutelage. Roosevelt began conservation, the national parks, Clean Meat, Clean Water Act, got rid of child labor. He did innumerable things to help us domestically. And he's a great president because he did things on the domestic front. Notice his predecessor, William McKinley, is often forgotten. That's because we need to do things domestically right now. Everybody notices. If you take a look at New York City, it looks like a total shithole compared to Beijing. It looks like a third world country compared to Saudi Arabia. Reading levels are going down. Healthcare prices are going up. Grocery prices are going up. But according to Fat Boy Mark Levin, we need more wars. It doesn't matter that housing's unaffordable. We need more wars. And unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who learned from that, and even President Obama, to his credit, after getting involved in Libya, he decided that we don't need to get involved as much into other foreign conflicts. And that's why, despite the red line in Syria, he didn't get involved directly in the Syrian civil war. That's the difference between pragmatic people versus idiots. Pragmatic people make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We make mistakes every day. But we learn from those mistakes, and then we act on the data that's available.